And gentlemen, today is May the 18th, 2025, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello?
Yo. Good evening.
Hey, how are you?
Doing pretty good. Yeah. On the grind. Doing some farm work and stuff today. It's a very different lifestyle. Yeah, we live on the heckin' farm out in South Dakota. You got dirt, you gotta plant stuff. If you want to plant stuff, you need not just any dirt, you need good, nutritious dirt so the plants can thrive. So I moved a whole bunch of bags of dirt around in the respective places because I got a healthy, strong back. So did that. The other day I was digging holes and stuff. There's all kinds of different stuff you have to do that's simple upkeep, but we have, I think, 13 or 14 laying hens, one rooster, and then 12 chicks that are growing up. So there's chickens, and we have 2 dogs, a greenhouse, and a garden. And then a bunch of acres of property and stuff, which you have to have maintenance and stuff with the fences and make sure you have defenses against your neighbor's cows.
Is the soil up in South Dakota not very good?
Not super good, but it's not the most limiting factor. The most limiting factor is the temperature swings. If you're trying to grow crops, because it'll go from a hot day of like 85 Fahrenheit to snowing the next day sometimes. So very wild temperature swings. And if there's an unexpected frost, it'll kill a lot of plants. So you have to be very prepared for what's going down.
Gotcha.
There's a lot more ranching than there is farming here. And the Native Americans who've traditionally lived here lived primarily off of the buffalo rather than like crops and stuff. The buffalo are very sturdy, super fuzzy giant cows, basically. So they can live through the harsh winters without too much problem. Did I tell you how one of their methods for hunting them?
What's that?
They get one person in buffalo furs basically disguising themselves as a buffalo, and they'll try to rile up the other buffalo and get them to run off of a cliff, and then they'll go harvest the buffalo at the bottom.
Okay.
So they don't have to fight them individually, they just scam them into running into a bad zone.
I think I'd heard about the cliff thing. I don't think I remember the dressing up as one bit.
Yep.
That's
You got to
news
convince
me.
them. If you're just a different ape creature and you're like, go run over there, they're like, no, heck you. But if you're another buffalo and they're like, run, they're like, okay. But yep, my usual shenanigans of Dodo and stuff this week. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, how many... It seems like you could kill quite a few using that method.
Yeah.
So what do you do with all of the meat and other things?
Well,
Like, surely you can't eat all of that in the short term.
that's true. However, if you kill them near the winter time, there's a world's largest freezer. It's called outside. So stuff keeps pretty well if you just have it frozen because it's hecking freezing here. So I don't know all the history, but you need to like research exactly the times of year they would do that. But yeah, if you get too many, then there'll be some that goes to waste, of course. But I don't know what methods they would have for preservation other than maybe finding some kind of salt. But that would feed a lot of people. Buffalo are huge. I think they're one of the largest mammals in North America, like maybe top 3 by weight.
Yeah, it sounds about right. We pretty much killed all of the other ones.
Mm-hmm.
And there used to be a lot of mammoths and whatnot.
Yep.
Pretty much all wiped out. I think there was some other megafauna too. South America in particular had a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard of the giant sloth?
Yes, that's the one that was just in my mind before you said it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of crazy stuff around before humanity ate them all.
Mm-hmm.
We're quite ravenous in that regard.
Yeah, we didn't really have the lingo of sustainability. back then. It was more so
No.
score whatever like energy and food that you can at any cost.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I saw a documentary about how the first, I guess, Maori, or their ancestors maybe, that came to New Zealand, at first were kind of living more or less in equilibrium with the environment, but eventually they burned down all of the forest because they found that to be a very effective way of hunting, and that eventually decimated the food supply that they had been reliant on. And supposedly, the way the documentary presented it, that's what augured their transition into a more aggressive, warlike culture.
Who would they war with?
Each other. Yeah.
Yeah, they have their cool battle dancing song thing that we saw in their New Zealand legislature. Forget the name of that. Haka, I think
Haka.
that's what it's called. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I'm still trying to organize my notes here. There's been a lot going on. It's a little easier to talk about if it's organized somehow.
All good.
But I don't know how interested. I mean, stuff has been happening in the tariff stuff and the trading relationship, that is, Ukraine negotiations. But other than that, I don't necessarily have a whole lot to get to. And so it's kind of wide open today.
And the thing that the greatest number of people have asked about is the jet. And they
The
said
Atari jet.
yeah, and they said there's a $400 trillion deal of some kind. I don't know what that was about.
The jet is worth $400 million.
Oh, maybe they had some extra zeros there.
Maybe. Yeah, it's worth $400 million. I heard that they've been trying to sell it for some time and haven't been able to find a buyer. So they may be just trying to unload it on Trump here.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless of the context, it's not really legal to just gift a jet to an individual president.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's not supposed to be illegal. That's not supposed to be legal, rather. Especially given that they were trying to set it up so that it would be transferred to him after he was no longer president. So you can't really do that. If you just want to give it to the government, you could probably finagle that, but that doesn't seem to be what they're trying to do.
What are they looking to get out of it?
I mean, it's just a gift from their perspective. It's just influence peddling. You give something of value to another leader in the hope that you can get in their good graces, such that they might do you a favor in the future or continue doing a favor they're already doing for you. It's very prototypical influence peddling type diplomacy that you would see in other countries. In the United States, we generally have laws that kind of restrict that, and previous presidents have shied away from it because it's a bad look domestically. But of course, Trump is well known for not really caring about norms so much. So he's just kind of powering through and seems to be trying to get it. He seems to want the jet. They want to use it as their new Air Force One, which of course comes with any number of security issues.
Well, I would think that it would be something they would want to get some like payoff for during Trump's presidency, because if they give it to him and then the next president comes in, like, what are they going to do to honor that unless they're still using it, which is weird.
Well, keep in mind that the relationship Middle Eastern countries have with the United States is very transactional. Like, nominally, the United States is obligated to defend them. I think I told you before that Qatar hosts the headquarters for a naval fleet, a U.S. naval fleet. But the United States has no mutual defense treaties with any country in the Middle East. We are not obligated legally to defend them. We simply promise to do so because it's in our interest to try to preserve some degree of stability in the main oil-producing region on the planet. So it's of immense strategic value to do that. However, the extent to which the United States will actually protect them is very much variable because, again, there's no inherent legal obligation to that. So as a result, Middle Eastern governments go out of their way to try to curry favor with the United States and vice versa, to try to maintain good relations that are cooperative in nature so that if one or the other needs a favor, then the other is willing to hear them out. So you kind of saw that fall apart a little bit during the Obama administration and to a lesser degree the Biden administration when there was more criticism about human rights abuses and whatnot. And everybody kind of kept each other at arm's distance to the point that when the Biden administration famously approached Middle Eastern partners to try to get them to increase oil production to alleviate pressure on gasoline prices in the United States, they wouldn't give them the time of day because he had not really engaged in that kind of traditional diplomatic dance that they were used to. The Trump administration, in both its current iteration and in its first-term iteration, was quite happy to indulge in that dance. That style of transactional politics is very familiar to Trump. He prefers that style. So he was willing anyway to indulge that. And the result is that they were generally more willing to play ball, although Trump himself famously, while he was willing to engage in that style of diplomacy, was also relatively reluctant to get involved in various Middle Eastern conflicts and whatnot, since, of course, he was elected to try to get the United States out of that. So there was some disappointment on the part of Middle Eastern countries with a lack of enthusiasm in the Trump administration for that type of adventurism. They've moderated their expectations somewhat, but they still see Trump as more willing than, say, left-wing alternatives in the United States to play ball with them. And so they continue to try to give him what he wants, lavish him with praise, give him gifts, money, deals, quote unquote, of one kind or another in order to try to win his favor. Again, this is a very old system set up. Even before Trump, Obama, etc., it was normal for the United States, for example, to promise security to the region, and in exchange, the region would buy one U.S. debt that was actually a big deal in the 70s. Not so much a big deal anymore. The petrodollar is way overrated these days. But in the 70s, there was a real fiscal crisis in the United States that the petrodollar helped alleviate. The other thing that the Middle Eastern countries buy from the United States is defense equipment. And that's kind of a part of the de facto industrial policy that we're not supposed to have, where we kind of shovel money into the defense industry in the United States to try to keep it afloat and ensure some degree of minimal capacity is maintained across time. So Middle Eastern partners help with that by spending lots of money on U.S. kit of various kinds that they very frequently historically did not end up bothering to really use or even necessarily learn how to use. I think Mohammed bin Salman, the current leader of Saudi Arabia, is one of the first leaders to significantly and consistently use Saudi military power, up to and including the equipment they get from the United States. So the exception kind of proves the rule there. He's quite unusual in doing that. So that was kind of the quid pro quo for a long time. And, whenever U.S. leaders would travel to the Middle East to meet with these guys, they would very frequently make a big deal about defense procurement. They would announce that there would be some kind of new purchase of, some umpteen $billion of U.S. equipment of one kind or another, and maybe also billions of dollars in investment as well. And, a lot of that was just choreographed. A lot of it was stuff that they were just going to do anyway, but that they repackaged for immediate consumption in the United States. Again, all of that was just very transactional, and it fits Trump's style of politics to a T. And so he's been indulging in that for a while now. So gifting a jet to Trump himself is a little unusual in that generally Middle Eastern partner countries don't directly gift stuff to individual presidents. But it's perfectly normal in terms of just the traditional influence being peddling that it goes on between the U.S. government and Middle Eastern governments that it's nominally allied to. Mm-hmm. So that's why they gave the jet.
Gotcha. Farming reputation is what we would say in video games.
There you go.
You can do that in WoW, where you just buy, and not a jet per se, but you have some material good of value. It could be an expensive cloth. It could be a ore type, like gold or silver or iron or some crap. And you just give a bunch of it to a city, and then your standing in that city goes up. So pretty simple transaction. You just grab a bunch of supplies. So in this case, you get a very fancy jet that maybe you had trouble selling because nobody has that kind of money. And then
it's a 747.
But it's tricked out to the nines, I'm guessing.
Oh yeah, but like even if it wasn't, it would be very expensive. Are you familiar with 747s?
Refresh me.
That's the double-decker Boeing passenger jet.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's huge. They're very large. So it would be very expensive to buy and also to maintain, even if it had not been tricked out by, Middle Eastern sheikh billionaires of one kind or another. No doubt even more expensive with all of the extra things that have been added to it.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't read too much into it diplomatically. I don't think it's going to signify any significant change in American foreign policy in the region.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly it'll just be the source of angst and consternation in U.S. domestic politics.
Gotcha. It's definitely the one that people have been buzzing about, just because it's very salient. It seems like bribery, but if he's not getting anything, or if he's not promising anything in return, it's not super transactional, I guess. It's just them farming the rep.
Well, hypothetically, they could have extracted some kind of concession that we just don't know about yet, or that will in future be reframed as an individual decision taken by Trump without outside influence. It'll be a little hard to tell the difference. So the rules on not accepting gifts like this are specifically designed to prevent any kind of doubt from emerging in this vein. If you don't accept any of the gifts, then people don't have to worry about whether or not you were bribed or not.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be better in terms of the health of American political culture if he did not accept the jet, or if he did accept it, if he then gave it to some branch of the military for repurposing for some other task or something to that effect. But just taking it to keep for himself would be very crass, would undermine public faith in the government, even more than it's already been undermined, which is pretty significant.
It would be on brand.
It would be on brand, yeah, I agree. I don't doubt that.
Someone else asked about a New York incident that happened, but they didn't say what it was.
Yeah, the Mexican Navy attacked New York City.
What?
Fortunately, the Brooklyn Bridge was able to successfully defend the city.
What?
So the Mexican Navy, like the U.S. Navy, among other navies, will train its officers. Well, part of the training of officers will involve putting them on like an old sailing ship and then having them go on maneuvers. And it's supposed to be about, teamwork and seamanship and, all this kind of thing. It's all very old school Navy stuff. So one such ship that the Mexican Navy uses was on tour, I guess is the phrase. They had a class of graduates. What I read is that it's tradition for a class just before graduation to go on a trip on this vessel. And so it was going to travel from Mexico to New York, and then supposedly its trip would terminate in Iceland. Mm-hmm. So that was the plan. So while it was in New York City, apparently it lost power, is what I read. It's a sailing ship, so I don't know how that's relevant, but supposedly it lost power, and in turn it lost control, and it ended up reversing into the Brooklyn Bridge. Now, for the most part, that's not a big deal, but the masts on the ship, because it is an old school sailing ship, were high enough to be higher than the bridge itself, and so those actually snapped off as the ship moved under the bridge. Now, that was a problem because apparently there were some sailors on the masting when they snapped, and
no.
a bunch of them apparently fell. And what I was reading is that it was something like 2 dead, 30 injured.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. So kind of a bizarre incident. I'm not sure how that happens.
Oh
I think I did see in the video that there was a tugboat next to it. It might be that the tugboat was the one that lost power. That would make more sense to me. But the statement I read was that the Mexican ship itself, lost power. So make of that what you will. Regardless, it's kind of embarrassing for the Mexican Navy. You definitely don't like seeing that. Certainly don't like losing trainees. That's obviously tragic. Yeah, it's weird. I don't know how else to describe it. It's not substantive in terms of like greater geostrategy or anything. It's basically just a weird random incident. But it does make for interesting video.
Damn, yeah, chat's telling me I should watch the video. I'll watch it after. Anytime I watch a video during world discussion, the ad revenue gets taken away for it. So
Really?
we'll watch it later. Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I got removed because we watched that Vermin Supreme video. Him promising everyone a pony. And it's like, your video has been blocked in some countries and cannot be monetized because of Vermin Supreme. Okay. I hope that he got some money from that.
Wow. Censorship. Outrageous.
Yeah. Damn. So they're using an old-timey sailboat for this.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a technical name for it, like clipper, maybe, something like that. Mm-hmm. But to an ignoramus like me, it just looks like a sailing ship. Mm-hmm. It's a big one. It's not small. I think it had 4 masts.
Was there a storm or something?
Oh, no. No, it's perfectly fine. Just a freak accident.
Damn. They're saying it's called a trireme, 3 masts.
There you go. I would defer to chat on that. I'll send you a picture. You can kind of see what I'm talking about. Where are you? Neuro. There you go.
Oh, yeah. That's a bummer.
Accidents happen.
Remember that one? It's reminding me of the other boat mistake in the Panama Canal, where some big ass boat got stuck sideways.
Yeah, one of those big container ships.
Yep.
It was very awkward.
Help me, Step Canal. I'm stuck.
Yeah, there was quite the backup of ships outside the canal waiting for it to get opened again. I remember pictures showing ships pretty much as far as the eye could see, all the way to the horizon.
Mm-hmm. Any news on Biden's cancer prognosis?
I mean, that's just brand new news. That's breaking news from a few hours ago. So I really don't know anything more about it than what's already been released. Supposedly it's pretty aggressive, so he may not have long.
Did they say what type it was?
Prostate cancer, if I'm not mistaken.
Gotcha.
It's pretty common with older men, unfortunately.
Somewhat relevant shout out to the supporters of the Baldur's Gate 3 fundraiser we did for cancer research for American Cancer Society.
You still doing that?
No, that was just the one weekend event.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. We crushed it though. I haven't got them in the mail yet, but because we raised so much, I have some fancy Magic the Gathering cards that I can give away to people or, yeah. Keep for myself if I'm greedy, but I don't play Magic. I have one Magic the Gathering card that my friend Apoptosis gifted me because he knows I like elf ladies, so I have Galadriel.
Have you ever played Magic the Gathering?
I've played Magic the Gathering Arena on PC, so I roughly know what the game is, but I haven't played with cards and stuff in person.
Oh man, it's pretty fun, I have to say.
I believe it. I've heard it's expensive if you want to be like try hard about it.
There's a lot of cards. If you want to optimize, then you're probably going to be buying individual cards, and the best ones can be pricey. Or you can just play the odds and buy a whole shit ton of packs. That also will be very pricey. I always liked it, but I was never any good at it.
Mm-hmm.
Really loved the artwork on the cards, though. Top-notch stuff.
Yeah. From what I've seen, agree.
Not to go too far down that tangent, but did you have a play style you preferred?
Not that I remember. I just picked stuff that looked cool.
Gotcha.
You're supposed to have like lands or something. Yeah. If I just explained it, people probably just cringe. I don't really know how the game works that well.
Oh, well, we can get into that sometime.
I respect it. Seems like one of those games of skill that's timeless and will be around for indefinite period. It's kind of like one of the StarCrafts of card games, where it's been around for a long time, but it's not really going to go away. There isn't really a competitor that hits a similar set of notes of like a try-hard tabletop card game.
Yeah, you definitely strike me as a fire deck guy.
Why?
Well, there's different lands, and the different lands allow you to play specific cards that can only be tapped using those kinds of lands. One of them is fire, and the fire decks are very aggressive. They're very much offense-oriented.
Cool. My Dota play and my StarCraft play are more defensive. But I don't
Really?
know. Yeah. My favorite Dota heroes are Drow Ranger and Terrorblade, and they're two agility characters that scale really well. The more items and gold they get, so the longer the match goes, generally the better off they're going to be. So I'm happy to play an hour-long game.
You know why I assumed you were aggressive? You told me you tried Civ once, and that you tried to be really aggressive, like you play StarCraft.
That's the thing. I don't play StarCraft super aggressive, kind of like a solid style. If I'm playing a game that's turn-based, I end up being aggressive because I'm impatient with the tempo. So I will choose an aggressive strategy for a turn-based game, when if I was playing a real-time game, I usually end up liking the back foot more. It was really fun playing BG3 with you. I'm kind of itching to start another run. I don't know. But yeah, for that, playing with you was a very different vibe than playing with the other four guys, but it was really successful in its own way. And it's nice to plan things out and make sure you don't go into stuff with a dumb angle. We didn't get as stuck in bad situations, I felt like.
Yeah, we were pretty in control most of the time.
Yeah.
Printing presses notwithstanding.
Yeah. We learned some of the honor mode specific mechanics too, where on Tactician it might be a fine thing to try, but on honor mode they get really pissed. Yeah, I think
How was your other run going?
We had an internet problem. This week has been just full of internet problems for both me and our friend Broken Helix. So his internet went out in the Underdark right when the Bulliet was jumping out of the ground. So it knocked some of us down and the ground is rumbling and his internet went out. So we didn't want to just do a key fight like that without him. So we ended up playing Dota and stuff instead.
Well, that sucks.
Yeah, but then my internet went out on Thursday because we had a crazy windstorm. So I got the internet curse.
South Dakota conspires against you, Neuro.
I know. But there's an amazing feature of that game. You can play BG3 offline. You don't need an internet connection to play. It just has to resync the next time that you log in. So I got to spend Thursday night just playing my own solo run. I made a Cambion Shadow Sorcerer. And she looks the same as Mizora. Because if you have a certain mod, you can use Mizora's face. That's fun. And my brother's been playing Doom the Dark Ages.
I've heard of that.
Yeah. The Doom series is the best single-player first-person shooter campaign in the past 10 years, probably. So if you ever wanted to do that. It's pretty sweaty, but it's very, very good.
Well, was there any other specific part of the world you wanted to get to?
Not particularly. Someone mentions Israel-Palestine every time we do this, so...
I don't really have anything new there either. I think Israel is ramping up a new offensive. Although I think I read recently that they're also going to allow more food in.
Mm-hmm.
They've effectively been stopping foreign aid from getting in, so that represents something of a climb down for them. It's not going to be a whole lot, but it is a substantive reversal. So that and the offensive, pretty much the only thing I would have to report. I don't have anything new in that regard. Yeah, most of the drama around the world is pretty much on trend.
Gotcha.
You know, there's maneuvering in the Ukraine conflict and the peace negotiations around that, but I'm not any more optimistic about the trajectory of that than I was before last time we talked. And I would say pretty much the same about the trade negotiations that the Trump administration is leading. I don't really have a lot of optimism about where that's going either. There has been some de-escalation there. We might get into that. But we've also talked about that ad nauseum over the past few months. So I don't know how excited people are for more of that. Yeah, there was just some miscellaneous stuff. Actually, we could talk about Trump's trip to the Middle East. He actually was traveling for the past couple weeks and did stuff while he was out and about. That's actually the genesis of the whole jet controversy. He was visiting Qatar. Or was it that he was visiting Saudi Arabia and the Qataris talked to him there? I don't remember exactly. But it was specifically because he was in the region that they did that. Let's see. Did we talk about the ceasefire with the Houthis?
I don't think so.
Do you remember that they were attacking shipping in the Red Sea?
Yes.
Yeah. So before the trip, I think that they actually negotiated a ceasefire with them. Yeah, we might have mentioned this last time. I don't recall, so I apologize if I'm being redundant. But the Trump administration, after launching some airstrikes targeting Houthi infrastructure in Houthi-occupied Yemen, actually did reach out to them and negotiate a ceasefire. So the Houthis, for their part, have agreed to stop attacking shipping in the Red Sea. And in exchange, the U.S. government is going to stop blowing them up, basically. The airstrikes in Yemen will cease. So, you know, that is progress. That is an achievement for the administration, and that will help international trade in so much as it opens up shipping in the Red Sea again. However, it was noted that that deal did not encompass Israel. And since that deal was signed, the Houthis have continued to fire various munitions at Israel, much to the chagrin of the Israeli government, which wasn't too happy about that development. They were kind of hoping that they would be a part of any negotiation. Hasn't been the case. Yeah, there was kind of a pattern in that regard. I was reading that the Israeli government was not thrilled about Trump's trip through the Middle East, because he actually didn't visit them. He was actually only visiting Arab countries. Now, the administration says not to read too much into that. The administration says that they just wanted to focus on getting deals done, you know, with the big Gulf monarchies, and that the relationship with Israel is still strong. But, Israel noted the Houthi ceasefire didn't include them. And there was also some stuff that happened with regard to Syria that they didn't like. I thought this was really interesting. So Trump meets with the Saudi leadership, he talks with them, and then afterwards there's a surprise meeting between Trump and the president of Syria, which had not been scheduled. And as you recall, the president of Syria is the leader of a group, HTS, which used to be an Al-Qaeda affiliate before it broke with them. So basically, the president of Syria is a sort of former jihadi, depending on who you talk to. And the U.S. government's position after the end of the Syrian civil war was that sanctions that had been in place against the Assad regime would be maintained against the new regime until the new regime showed that the rest of the world, but the U.S. government specifically, that it would meet certain expectations. One, that it would not mistreat minorities, that it would not support terrorism, that it would run the country in a sort of kind of representative democratic way. Basically human rights stuff, prototypical Western pro-human rights expectations of one kind or another. And because the regime had not really satisfied that desire yet, the sanctions were never withdrawn. They had been still in place. Various governments in the region didn't really like that, including governments that didn't necessarily trust the new Syrian government. The Saudis, for their part, would have preferred a different outcome to the Syrian civil war. As we've discussed previously, they pretty much thought the war was over and that Assad was going to win. And if Assad was going to lose, they would have preferred one of the rebel groups that had better ties with them win, as was the HTS one, and they're more affiliated with Turkey, which has okay relations with the Gulf monarchies, but they would prefer to have more direct control. So there's a little bit of tension there. However, the Saudis, recognizing the outcome of the conflict, have been trying to build influence in Syria. They've been trying to make nice with the new government and try to establish some new ties in order to offset Turkish influence. So as part of that back and forth, it seems to me that the Saudi leadership talked Trump into doing this. I can't prove that. I haven't read anything to that effect, but given that it hadn't been announced beforehand and that it seemed to be a surprise, I think that it was something that the Saudis themselves set up. And I think they did that specifically so that they could try to do it as a favor for the new regime in order to try to get in their good favor. Now, during the meeting, it's not really entirely clear what they talked about, but afterwards, Trump did announce that he would be ending sanctions on the Syrian government. Again, very surprising. That's pretty much a total 180 from what the US government had been saying before. Now, some people have kind of lauded that as an example of what the sort of strongman style leadership that Trump exemplifies can achieve, because, in previous administrations, whether or not to drop sanctions would have involved a lengthy interagency consultation that would have dragged out for months, and then maybe it would have been decided upon. And probably if they had decided to end sanctions, it would have been a slow withdrawal of sanctions, repeal of sanctions, rather, that would have happened over time rather than all at once. So Trump being very decisive here and kind of making a decision and imposing it on everybody. That can be good, hypothetically, in so much as ending sanctions would be beneficial to the Syrian economy. It could really help out the new government and give them good incentive to actually adhere to the demands that the U.S. government has been making of them, rather than making it difficult for their economy to recover and conditioning the end of sanctions. That approach, the conditional approach, has the downside of kind of incentivizing them aligning with more radical actors in the region. If you can't build your economy by having normal ties with other countries, normal economic ties, that does incentivize engaging in smuggling, drug running, maybe doing trade with other countries that are being sanctioned and tariffed by the United States, like Iran. By ending the sanctions, you give them an avenue to improve their economy and alleviate political pressure on the government that allows them an alternative pathway that's more legitimate. and does not so incentivize negative behavior of one kind or another, so to put it. So Trump's approach has its merits. The downside to this, the downside to his approach, as opposed to the more traditional slow roll approach, is that because there hasn't been an interagency consultation and whatnot, there probably will be some problems, because the Syrian government, while it probably does deserve a chance to prove itself, also does have clear-cut problems with elements within itself that are still radical in outlook, maybe have ties to extremist groups of one kind or another, and that probably have been engaging in some degree of human rights abuses, as we've seen over the past few months, with various flare-ups and violence between various communities and government forces of one kind or another. So a slow roll approach probably would have identified that and recommended to the president that some sanctions be removed, or maybe that sanctions be partially repealed, but that full repeal should be conditioned on those specific areas, those specific problem areas that have emerged, being addressed by the new government in a substantive way. And that could, hypothetically, incentivize the government more to actually cramp down on that kind of behavior, more so than right now, where there is an incentive in so much as the sanctions could return later, but they're going to get a big benefit in the short term. And it may be that other things happen such that the Syrian government feels that sanctions are inevitable, and so just takes advantage of the temporary repeal of the sanctions, the downtime, so to speak, in order to try to steel itself for the return of sanctions later. So, all of this would have been discussed in a normal process, but as is, it hasn't. So the Trump administration here is, like it very frequently does, gambling. They're basically gambling on this outcome being positive. And then if it's not later on, they'll just shrug it off and say, hey, it was worth a shot. Mm. So that was probably the most surprising thing to happen during his Middle Eastern trip. We'll see if it pays off or not. I choose to be optimistic about that, because I had been hoping that the administration would take a softer line on Syria to kind of give them more of an incentive not to be crazy. To try to give them something to work with in the short term to boost the economy. And hopefully that stabilizes the political situation and gives the government more breathing room. But as I so often have been, since I've been following international affairs, I could easily be wrong, and this could blow up in everybody's face. So we'll see. Keep your eye on that space. Let's see, the media and the Trump administration kind of made a big deal about billions of dollars in investments that were announced. This is mostly bullshit. The Saudi government had already announced $600 billion worth, I think, of investments months ago, when the Trump administration was still new, had just gotten inaugurated. And even at that time, it was obviously just bullshit. They were basically repackaging a bunch of stuff they were already going to do and pretending it was some kind of new investment. For example, a lot of that is just defense procurement. They're going to buy hundreds of billions of dollars worth of U.S. military kit. And again, that's something that they always do. That's not new. And so trying to frame that as being investment in the United States is extremely misleading, clearly. So basically, they've just done more of that. And not just the Saudis, but also the Emiratis, the Qataris, etc. It's still money, right? It's not bad. I'm not shitting on the administration for cutting deals of one kind or another, but I would just like everybody to keep in mind that this is not actual investment in the United States. A lot of this is just normal trade that was already happening or was already going to happen. So this is not master deal making at work. This is just normal Middle Eastern diplomacy. Business as usual, if you will. And the other item, the final item here, was that the Trump administration actually negotiated directly with Hamas and got them to release, I think that's what it is, the last surviving American hostage that was being held in Gaza. Some of the people that were kidnapped by Hamas during the October attack in 2023 were dual citizens. They were both Israeli and American. And so, of course, Washington has been particularly keen to try to get the American citizens out of Gaza. And so, unfortunately, many died. There was only one left alive. And the Trump administration, to its credit, was able to negotiate his release. I haven't read any details about what kind of quid pro quo was involved there. It could just be that the Trump administration threatened them, and that Hamas figured that it was just cheaper to release this one guy that gave Washington an excuse to be directly involved. Now that he's gone, there's not as much impetus for Washington to be interested. And so the gamble by Hamas here may be that they're hoping the Trump administration will kind of be less invested in the conflict now and will apply less pressure to Hamas going forward. That's my best guess. But again, pure speculation on my part. We'll see what kind of deal was cut there eventually, I'm sure. Yeah, I don't think the Israeli government was too thrilled about that either, come to think of it. I think I did read that the Israeli government announced, well, maybe not announced, but told reporters that it was not involved in that negotiation. So the Trump administration taking the initiative, to put it diplomatically, in the Middle East. Got a little bit to show for it. Mostly business as usual. But the bold gambles will certainly be interesting to watch going forward. We'll see how that plays out.
So is the Trump administration as a stance favorable to Israel or not?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the Trump administration's position is that it supports Israel to the hilt. Now, in practice, who's to say? Because everybody knows Trump is very transactional. Israel, for the most part, kind of takes care of itself, so I think that makes them more of an appealing partner for the Trump administration, because they have isolationist tendencies. That is to say, the Trump administration has isolationist tendencies. They would prefer not to be directly involved with Middle Eastern conflicts. So allies in the region that kind of pull their own weight and just lean on the United States for more indirect support, I think that is more the model that the Trump administration would like to support. And Israel already does that, so they seem particularly amenable to Israel when it asks for help, because they generally don't, for the most part. Now, in the past, in Trump's first term, there actually was some enmity between the Netanyahu government and the Trump administration, because the Netanyahu government was generally pretty pushy. They, not infrequently through Netanyahu's governance of Israel, in terms of his management of the relationship with the United States, he has kind of imposed himself. He has used allies in Congress and in the public relations sphere in the United States to apply pressure to various governments. He's demanded assistance from the United States during various conflicts with Hamas, and generally demanded it in sort of very unfriendly terms. He generally makes whatever government is sitting in the United States look bad when he pressures them, saying that they're not supporting an ally, that Israeli democracy is in peril and Washington is derelict in its duty to protect it. Very stark terms. The language that comes out of Netanyahu is generally very Manichean, to put it mildly. So the result of that is generally some degree of tension. And while Trump was more favorable to Netanyahu, even he was kind of tired of his bullshit by the end of his first term. So it could be that something similar plays out here. The Trump administration nominally supports Netanyahu, but if Netanyahu gets too out of hand, or if supporting Israel gets to be too toxic in domestic American politics, they could pull back. I don't know how substantive a pullback it would be, but they could pressure them. I've read some interpretation of the fact that Trump did not visit Israel during his trip may itself be manifestation of that. That may be the Trump administration's way of saying, hey, we support you, but you're not really doing what we tell you, and it's kind of aggravating. So if you want us to continue taking you seriously and continue helping you, you need to play ball with us. Nominally, the Trump administration actually does, while it supports Israel, want an end to the conflict in Gaza. Trump's whole thing is that he's supposed to be a peacemaker and he's promised to end wars and whatnot. He was referring more to Ukraine, since that's the one that's been more expensive for the United States. But he's also tried, at least, again, nominally, to end the conflict in Gaza. And he would like to put that feather in his cap, if possible. And the more Netanyahu drags out the conflict, probably for domestic political reasons, the more aggravated Washington gets with him. Because Washington doesn't benefit in the same way Netanyahu does from a continuation of the conflict. So there could be grounds for tension there that grows into something more later on. For now, pretty manageable. It may be that the Trump administration doesn't even actually care that much. My position has long been that the Trump administration prefers to make dramatic, bold moves for easy wins, and that if the easy wins don't manifest quickly, then they tend to back off. So it could be that they want to pressure Israel and Hamas in the short term to try to get them to end the conflict, but that if nothing happens, then they just kind of back off and focus on other things. Mm-hmm. I suspect that's what's going to happen here, but we'll see. See, I did have some Africa stuff if you want to do that.
Sure.
Have you ever heard of Benin?
Benin. No, I don't think so.
Yeah, maybe it's pronounced Benin. I don't know. But it's a small country in West Africa. And you would probably recognize it if you saw it. It's one of those two slivers, right? There's two countries in West Africa that are basically just lines. They're very small, very narrow. They're both between Nigeria and Ivory Coast, if memory serves. One of them is Benin, the other one is Togo. Originally, I want to say Benin was a French colony, and then Togo, to the west of Benin, was the German colony. And then after World War I, France and Britain split German Togo. Was that what it was? No, I don't think that's what it was. Togo went to the UK, and then a big chunk of it, that is to say, a big chunk of German Togo, was absorbed by Ivory Coast. I want to say it was something like that. I don't know. It's been too long since I've read about it. Anyway, Benin was a French colony, very small country. It actually used to be pretty powerful in the early modern period of history. So like, let's say 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. That's because it was a major exporter of slaves. And if I remember correctly, the kingdom of Benin, again, whichever way it's pronounced, was particularly militant. It was like a very militant, aggressive tribe, and so they were particularly good at generating exports of slaves. And as a result, they ended up being one of the more powerful kingdoms along the coast of West Africa. So much so that they were actually one of the last kingdoms in the region to be subjugated by Europeans. And in fact, they were never really subjugated per se. What the French actually did is it made the Kingdom of Benin a protectorate, which is different than just invading and colonizing it, which is what they generally did. So the French were sufficiently deterred from just outright attacking.
Mm-hmm. Did you get muted? Is the stream okay? Press 2 if the stream is okay. The stream is okay. We got a 2. Weird. Lost Agent Smith, though. Smith is silent. He said his computer crashed. He just texted me. Gotcha. To fill time, this opponent that we're facing right now is the one who whispered me after the game when I said WP and said, you say GG. And this person didn't GLHF at the start and also asked for a pause at the start. So they are scoring about as low as you can on SC2 behavior score. We'll see how this match plays out. My opener had some pretty nice aggression. Got a lot of work done. And their BC pressure didn't really deal much, so I like it. Bit of a nasty boy we're dealing with here. Let's get a fourth base. We will learn more once his computer restarts. It had a crash. Let's go tanks now. Nice. It's so quiet. We're just here with our thoughts. Yep. You gotta think about it. Think about macro. Imagine the sounds of the Zerg. What might they be saying right now? And so on. I said he's back in 10 to 15. Okay. Gotcha. Imagine that. Gonna drop this guy. If they're stream sniping, then they'll know. Oh, they don't have any stuff here. Just kill their production buildings. Lovely drops. Let's get some bases. Let's be quietly ASMR this game. +3 range attacks. Could drop on top of these, that would be cool. Oh man. I bet you they don't GG if they lose. I bet you, chat. Unless they're listening and they decide to break character. They were super BM before, so... I almost wanted to block them at the start of the game, but I was like, you know what? I think the entertainment value is too high. We have to see. We have to see their nastiness. And see if they change. Will they change tack? Place your bets, ladies and gentlemen. For the content. This player is super mad. He has the anger of 1,000 sons and 1,000 daughters. Place your bets. As we glide sweetly into our opponent's home base, which is sorely lacking in defense because our army is too mighty and strong. They typed 1G! Whoa, we're halfway there. Whoa, living on bread. Take my hand, we'll make it, I swear. Whoa, living on bread. Living on bread. Are you trying to not scare off the wild mech player? Thank you for the Prime, Griever. They gave us 1G. That was so funny. I think it was during the last world discussion. You don't mind the golf commentary? Our lovely guest's computer crashed, so he's restarting. G number 2. We got enough G's from the chat. If you focus enough, you could hear Miami echoing. Yeah. Now 20-1. You are very rude. They had to showboat a little bit. Probably top 1. You are brain dead. Oh! Didn't you beat him twice already? Look, let's not get into the details of this. Second G plus an official cookbook. Good luck, buddy. Do you have anything on your mouse side buttons? I think it's page up, page down. I only have the 2 things. You're brain dead, then why you lose? You know, that's one of the things that I've cautioned people against, is if you insult the intelligence of your opponent and then you lose to that opponent, do the math. Do the math. They're gonna snipe us here. Watch this. Watch. We dodged him. I wonder if they would quit to get me, if they're that horny for me. Let's check. Because they played like a 2-minute game just then. It said they got in a match. Oh, the Terran insta-quit against them. Oh. Interesting. Let's see. Does this person insta-quit their versus Terran? What kind of nasty Smurf account is this? What the hell is this? But then they insta-quit against him. Hella sus. Shit talking after you've won is BM. It's only cool when you do it when there are stakes at play. Yeah. It's okay. I've dealt with ego monsters before. Mainly People are like this when they're lacking in fulfillment and satisfaction in their own achievements up to this point. I have no need to showboat over people and to talk shit to them because I already feel satisfied. If I were to pass away tomorrow, I would be proud that I ran a marathon, graduated college, was in a fight club and did really well, got GM in StarCraft, led a WoW guild, had great friends in my life, got to travel. I'm happy. I've done some good stuff. So there's no need for me to shit on other people to make myself feel better because I already feel great. And I hope that other people rise to meet their goals as well because I like cheering for people to succeed. To me, I think it's awesome if someone else succeeds. It doesn't make me insecure. Like if Giant Gnome gets heckin' GM after not playing for a long time, he's a beast. I'm not scared. I'm proud of him. He's a fellow Zerg, and this is a fucking Protoss storm farming meta. So if people are succeeding in their goals and humanity is happier, I'm part of humanity. So I'm happier. You see that? You can be a team player with humanity. It's kind of a weird idea, but oops. Don't need a double overlord there. This person is very grouchy, egotistical, and angry at stuff. I don't know why. Hello, welcome back.
Sorry, finish your thought.
We just faced a very grouchy person who is the kind who will say mean things to you if they win, and they will also say mean things to you if they lose. And I was kind of hypothesizing as to why, and why people might be motivated to do that or not, and kind of listing my reasons why I do not do that. But yeah, it's petty internet keyboard warrior behavior. Almost no one who types stuff like that at you would say shit to you in the face, like in real life. It's like a cowardly move, and it's also kind of a venting mechanism for them to deal with life stresses, because life is stressful. Even if we're living in the modern era, there's a lot to be upset about, and there's a lot of difficulty, even for our generation. So we defeated this opponent, and then after the game, they apparently told me what my score is against them, which I don't even know who this person is, so they're apparently very fixated on that kind of outcome. And as an added point of sauce, while we're doing world discussion and you're talking to me about current events in Africa, I couldn't give two fucks and a shit about whether I win or lose in my match. And they're sweating their ass off, like fighting for their life and their pride or something. And I'm like, okay. Oh, that happened in Syria? Okay. Oh, cool. Interesting. And I might lose the game, but I don't care. But apparently this person cares very much and keeps score. Very close score of this when I'm on my alt account. Okay, so I think we left off in Africa. And then, yeah.
Yeah, so it's Benin.
Benin,
I looked up how it's pronounced. Benin. Yeah, sorry for the technical difficulties. I'm not sure why it does that. Every so often it does. Well, let's see. Yeah, so Benin, small country. Also, I looked up the map. It's not between Nigeria and the Ivory Coast. It's between Nigeria and Ghana. That's what tripped me out. I should say Benin and Togo are between those two countries. But anyway, yeah, Benin was a powerful slave trading state. It was run by a relatively militant tribe that was very aggressive, and it was powerful enough that it avoided direct intervention by European power during the age of great European expansion in the late 1800s. Rather, the kingdom was made into a protectorate of the French Empire. Later on, there was eventually direct rule, but that came a bit later, once French control once the French position in Benin had been consolidated. And I think after that, it was basically just one part of many in the French Empire in West Africa, which was quite large at that time, and eventually became independent, I think in the early 1960s, and pretty quiet after that. I think the only interesting thing that happened during the Cold War is that the government there briefly kind of flirted with communism. There was a period when it kind of explicitly was run by a Marxist government and that wanted to align with the Soviets, but established economic ties were almost entirely with France, so they could only kind of do that to a certain extent without sabotaging their existing economy. And so eventually they kind of ameliorated. Eventually they came around on the French and restored relations and became a more or less normal part of Francafrique, sort of France's sphere of influence, if you will, in West Africa. And that had more or less been the case up until, well, I mean, it still pretty much is the case, honestly. I don't think Benin has really broken away from the French too much like some of the other countries in the region have. It's not an especially wealthy country. It's mostly, I think, chocolate exports, or more specifically, the raw ingredient for chocolate, cocoa. The vast majority of the world's cocoa is grown in West Africa, and so Benin naturally also gets a chunk of that. Relatively small market share compared to like Ivory Coast, you know, by comparison, but it's enough to kind of power its economy. So it's a relatively little known country. Not a whole lot happens, but the only reason I bring it up is because there was actually a big terrorist attack relatively recently. I think it was a week or two ago. And there was 54 soldiers who were killed. Damn. Pretty high number as far as terrorist attacks go. The group in question was an Al-Qaeda affiliate. There's a fair number running around in the Sahel region right now. And one of them apparently made a foray into northern Benin. Pretty much the northern part of every coastal country in West Africa is part of the Sahel. So I think we've talked about the Sahel before, haven't we?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So for the most part, most of the instability in the Sahel is in the primary Sahel countries, you know, your Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, etc. But every so often a rebel group will raid into one of the surrounding countries to the south. And that seems to be what happened here. So Sahelian instability bleeding over a little bit into the surrounding region. I think Benin is also one of the countries in West Africa that still hosts some French troops. It's been a big shift away from hosting French troops over the past 10 years, but I think Benin is one of the ones that have kicked that trend. I think they still have some. Yeah, Ivory Coast and Senegal, I think, are the other two main ones at this point. Although Senegal did announce that they were going to be ejecting them. And I think Ivory Coast made a similar announcement as well. Yeah, Francafrique very much in decline these days. Let's see. Other Africa stuff. There's been more tensions in Ethiopia. I don't know how much of the Tigray War you remember from back in the day, but the party that governed Tigray province and that pretty much started that conflict has been banned now in Ethiopia, which is a pretty bold move considering the previous conflict. The government says that the TPLF failed to hold a general assembly, basically failed to hold elections and form a new government, which had been part of their peace agreement that had been signed to end the aforementioned Tigray War. The TPLF, for its part, says that it could not do that, not because it didn't want to, but rather because the party has basically split now into two main factions with different leaderships. And because of that split, it's effectively impossible to really do anything in the province. So as you might guess, the TPLF, or at least the faction that's nominally in control of the province, have said that the Ethiopian government banning the TPLF is a threat to the peace, in so much as it breaches the peace agreement that ended the Tigray War. And they're asking the African Union to step in and try to pressure the Ethiopian government into reversing this decision. And we'll see how it pans out. The Ethiopian government here could be sparking another conflict. The TPLF is not nearly as strong as it was back during the beginning of the Tigray War. But one imagines that they could still instigate a significant amount of violence if they wanted to. And it's not as though the Ethiopian government doesn't have problems elsewhere. They're still dealing with Oromo separatists. Well, not separatists, but Oromo extremists. The Oromo Liberation Front especially, that are running around the central part of Ethiopia. And they're still dealing with Somalia, which of course is an ever-present security issue for the Ethiopian government. And there's been drama with Eritrea as well, centering around the border region in Tigray and disputed territory. So, this doesn't really come at a great time, but obviously the government thinks that the gambit is worth the effort. So we'll see if this pays off for them or if it blows up in their face. We seem to be talking about gambles a good deal today.
Yeah, there's a lot of risk that goes into diplomacy and war. A lot of unknowns, so you've got to place a bet that you think this action will be more helpful than it is harmful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, such is the result of uncertainty. Let's see. Yeah, there's been more fighting, and I think we talked about Rwanda already. Yeah, we could probably just skip that. Let's see, Sudan. Do you really want to talk about Sudan? This is very violent and graphic. I don't know if you want to do this one. We can save this for later if you want.
Damn, is that bad?
Given the response to the story I did about the violence in Bangladesh a couple weeks ago, I'm a little wary. We've got plenty other to get to. Yeah, what is it, 10 o'clock?
Mm-hmm.
Well, some breaking news from today was that elections in Romania and Poland seem to show relatively center-left politicians winning power. Yeah, Romania in particular had attracted attention because the Trump administration, among other quarters in Europe and North America, had been saying that the establishment in Romania was trying to prevent, via duplicitous means, the far right from winning power. If you may recall, back at the end of 2024, there was a sort of populist right candidate that came out of nowhere to get the most votes in the presidential election. And everybody was kind of put off by that. The government believed it was the result of a disinformation campaign that was paid for, or at the very least co-opted, by Russian actors. And so with that in mind, they actually banned that candidate from running in the rerun of the election. So the new election saw a far-right candidate polling very well. A lot of people were kind of upset that the government had banned the previous guy. I think his name was Georgescu. And so they seem to be putting their votes behind the new far-right candidate. So there was some question about whether or not there might be a significant change in leadership in Romania as a result. But it seems, given the results as they've been announced thus far, that the sort of establishment center-left candidate, the former mayor of Bucharest, if I recall correctly, has won the presidency. So it seems like the status quo has won out in Romania, at least for the moment. And a similar outcome is predicted now for the election, I believe, for president in Poland. The presidential election in Poland is a little different. They kind of have a different separation of power in Poland, where I think the president and the prime minister are more or less co-equal. I think it's more of a ministerial system, so I think the prime minister is more powerful, but it's kind of more like France in that they share authority over different parts of the executive branch. So the president had been, I believe, a right-wing guy, kind of a holdover from the Law and Justice days. But the new guy seems to be center-left. Former mayor of Warsaw, I think is what I read. I'll throw out the usual disclaimer here. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in economics and foreign policy. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, Please let me know if I'm wrong. I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it eventually. And we do enjoy the feedback we get. So that said, I believe the establishment candidate, center-left establishment candidate, is going to win the presidency in Poland. Not as much of a win for the status quo as the win in Romania, but still quite notable. Yeah, the nuclear talks in Iran. We really haven't talked about this. Do you remember the nuclear deal the Obama administration signed with Iran back in the day?
Refresh me?
Basically, the gist of it was that Iran agreed not to refine uranium to, what was it, like 90%. Basically, they couldn't weaponize it. They could do low-grade uranium, but not the high-grade stuff necessary to build a nuclear weapon. And part of the agreement involved a whole bunch of surveillance mechanisms. They had to install cameras in nuclear facilities, this kind of thing. The quid pro quo was that the West, basically the rest of the world, would drop sanctions against Iran, which had been put in place in order to try to deter them from developing a nuclear weapon. And that deal got a lot of criticism from a variety of quarters, not even just right-wing ones, but even sort of more establishment or left-wing types, basically because the agreement, according to the criticism, was too narrowly focused on the nuclear deal. One of their criticisms was that the nuclear deal was that only lasted 10 years, for one, so it had a sunset provision. The Obama administration justified that by saying that basically a lot could happen in 10 years and that it would buy time for some kind of change in the underlying political calculus in Iran to emerge that would produce a government more amenable to a more substantive nuclear deal in order to permanently address the potential threat posed by Iran developing a nuclear weapon. But other criticisms included the fact that the agreement did not address things like ballistic missile development or broader Iranian intervention in the Middle East. Ballistic missiles are relevant because if you're going to develop a nuclear weapon, you need to develop technology to deliver that nuclear weapon. You know, it's one thing to develop a warhead, but if you don't have any kind of missile that can deliver that to a target, it's not that useful unless you just want to make a nuclear mine or something. So ballistic missile development has kind of gone hand in hand with nuclear development, and critics of the Obama administration said that they should have included restrictions on the development of longer-range ballistic missiles in Iran as part of the deal. They also said that the agreement should have included restrictions on Iranian behavior in places like Iraq and Syria, where there's been significant Iranian adventurism over the past couple decades. That didn't happen, and so the result is that the Obama administration could not really use sanctions to punish Iran for either developing ballistic missiles or engaging in adventurism in the Middle East. That tool was kind of off the table as a result of the nuclear deal. And so the United States was correspondingly somewhat hamstrung diplomatically in the region. Basically, their available tools were military force, which would have been very escalatory, to say nothing of domestically unpopular in the United States. And then on the other hand, the other option was just negotiations, which of course the Iranians could just delay for as long as they wanted to, so that they could continue to do what they were already doing. You know, again, developing ballistic missiles and intervening in neighboring countries. So the Trump administration, in its first term, famously abandoned the nuclear deal entirely. The critics, excuse me, the critics of the Obama deal were quite happy with that, but they were unhappy with the way that the Trump administration did it, which is to abandon the deal but then not have any kind of alternative in place, either in terms of a new deal restricting Iran's nuclear development or some kind of alternative plan in which there would be some kind of leverage used against Iran to try to force them to give concessions. Neither one of those things happened. Instead, the deal just kind of disappeared, and then the United States and Iran were put back to square one. So that resulted in the Iranians not really restarting their nuclear program per se, but slowly over time escalating the degree to which they enriched uranium. And they did this very purposely. Every few months, maybe 6 months to a year, they would announce that they'd further increased the grade of uranium that they were enriching. And they would do that to try to kind of pressure the U.S. government among, its various other counterparties to try to give concessions and return to the table. That is to say, return to the negotiating table. During the Biden administration, there was some push early in the administration to try to renew talks, but that ultimately didn't happen. And so the result is that there was no substantive change from the Trump administration in terms of the status quo. It didn't help that during the Trump administration, the first term of the Trump administration, there was a relatively dovish leader leading Iran, whom was willing to kind of negotiate, but didn't really have anybody to negotiate with in Washington. When Biden came in, he wanted to negotiate, but by then there was a new, more hawkish leader in Iran that did not want to negotiate. And so the negotiations never happened, and nothing really changed. So now we have Trump 2.0, the second term of the Trump administration. Over the past month or so, they've signaled pretty significant change in the way they want to approach the problem. Rather than just the maximum pressure style, which they'd done in the first term and had announced they would do at the beginning of the second term, they've slowly backed away from that and have been trying to kind of tease out the Iranian government to try to get them into a new negotiation. And they have actually been successful at that. There are what are called indirect negotiations happening in various third-party locales. If you don't know what that is, basically the Iranian government and the US government want to negotiate with each other, but they don't want to negotiate directly with each other in the same room. Instead, one party will be in one room, the other party will be in a different room, and then they'll have an intermediary basically run between rooms carrying their proposals from room to room.
Why don't they want to be in the same room?
Politics. Yeah, basically, neither party really wants to be seen to be giving concessions. And having talks at all is actually seen as a kind of concession. So to get around opposition to that, they'll say that they're willing to talk, but not directly, so that they can tell people back home, specifically hawkish elements in their own domestic politics, that, we're not negotiating directly with them. We're not giving them a concession. We're just sharing some ideas through a third-party intermediary. And that's supposed to kind of assuage some of the heat that they would normally, and probably will get anyway, from hawks back home. And to a lesser degree, the United States is also doing that, although with the Trump administration, obviously, they don't really give a shit. So this is more of an Iranian thing. Nominally, it's supposed to reflect the reluctance of the Iranians to engage in negotiations. But in practice, it really is just a direct negotiation with extra steps. So it's just political posturing for domestic political consumption in that sense.
That's funny. I can't be seen doing business with you, but that guy, he can take that piece of paper over to you and maybe you could look at it.
Yeah, that pretty much is the gist of it. So the nuclear talks had been ongoing. The Trump administration has been signaling that it might be willing to allow the Iranians to enrich uranium, continue to enrich uranium. That's actually a significant change from their previous position, which is that any new agreement should not allow the Iranians any degree of nuclear enrichment. So that's kind of a big climb down for them. Now, that doesn't mean that the Iranians will still be able to enrich uranium to a point where they could use it to make a nuclear weapon. Much like with the Obama deal, they would still be restricted from doing that. But the fact that the Trump administration has been willing to give ground on this suggests that there could be substantive room for progress here. However, there's been pushback in Washington from hawks, unsurprisingly, who were very critical of the Obama administration and kind of sense that the Trump administration basically, even if it refuses to admit it, is basically just going to renegotiate the Obama deal and re-implement it, which of course they don't like because that deal did not address any of the primary issues that they were interested in dealing with, specifically Iranian adventurism and ballistic missile development. So there's been some friction over that. And the most recent drama has been that the fourth round of the talks were postponed. This was an Iranian initiated thing. It's not entirely clear why. It might be a response to President Trump threatening action against countries that buy Iranian oil. One of the things that Trump has been doing over the past month and change is threatening what he calls secondary tariffs, where he basically would put tariffs on a country that is buying, say, oil from Russia. Now, such sanctions and tariffs don't really exist right now. Secondary sanctions and tariffs don't really exist now for Iran, but they could be put in place. And the idea there is to put extra pressure on Iran. And it could be that the Iranian government wants to try to deter that by threatening to scupper the nuclear negotiations. So a little bit of brinksmanship happening here. I don't know if it necessarily will amount to much. The current leader of Iran is, fortunately, relatively dovish. And the Trump administration is, for whatever reason, unexpectedly dovish all of a sudden in the recent months. So we actually seem to have some traction here for a potential deal. Whether or not one side or the other blows it up for one reason or the other, that remains to be seen. The current friction seems to illustrate that, but I suspect this is more of a superficial thing. I suspect this is the Iranians signaling that while they're negotiating, they don't want this kind of outside posturing happen. They would prefer the negotiations be restricted to their indirect process. So reasons for optimism there. We shall see. Also, a major port city in Iran blew up. That was also exciting.
Why? Why did it blow up?
There were some shipping containers that were full of fuel for missiles. Supposedly, I don't think it's been verified, but the theory is that they were on their way to Russia. Russia, of course, has quite a few missiles, and they've been using them quite a bit in their war with Ukraine. So there is some demand for fuel. So it seems that one shipment accidentally caught fire and exploded in quite spectacular fashion. Basically destroyed most of the port.
Damn.
I will try to send you the Reddit video. Because, of course, there's a video of it on Reddit.
There are videos of lots of things on Reddit.
Let's see, I've got to find the right one first. There you are. Yeah, the Trump administration getting some wins the past couple weeks. Nuclear talks kind of progressing relatively well, got the American hostage out. The Syrian gamble may or may not be a good thing, but, you know, given that I thought that was a good idea, I'm for it. So, some decent moves being made. No real progress on Russia-Ukraine, though. That continues to be just kind of mired in the mud, which is where I expect it'll stay. And the whole trade negotiation thing continues to be fairly stupid overall. I'm still not a fan. But in other areas, they are doing some decently smart things. So credit where credit is due. Did we have any questions, or was there anything you wanted to get to in particular?
Well, we might have had questions. We have Fuzzy Cord and Sea of Whiskey around.
Let's see. Gotta find the thing.
The channel.
Well, we had a question from last time we didn't get to. If we haven't already, can we get a breakdown on the arrests of political officials protesting ICE? I'm pretty sure that was just them trespassing, more or less. I don't think that was like some raid by ICE or by the FBI to try to go after them. The Trump administration has been threatening to do that, but they haven't actually done it, as far as I know. Yeah, I think that happened in New Jersey. There was a protest outside of some kind of ICE detention facility. And there were a couple of people that got into a confrontation with some of the local personnel, and they ended up getting arrested. The internet was not amused. Predictably, it freaked out. Well, it's pretty much the only question then.
So you sent me a whole bunch of maps.
Yeah, I sent you some stuff about the Armenian Highlands. I said last time we'd talk about it, so I wanted to send that ahead of time instead of trying to do it while I was explaining.
Mm-hmm.
So we can do that next if you want.
Yeah, sure. Once I'm out of the game, I can pull them up and we can look at them.
Gotcha. Yeah, so the Armenian Highlands is basically the region that separates Anatolia, which is the sort of big peninsula that Turkey is in, and then to the east, the Iranian Plateau. And then to the north is the Caucasus, and to the south is Mesopotamia. So if you look at a map, well, if you look at a topographical map anyway, it looks very, very rugged, very mountainous. And so it's not entirely clear, if you're not familiar with the region, where the strategic choke points are, what the most economically valuable areas are, if there are even any economically valuable areas. It just kind of seems like a big rugged mountain range that nobody can even really get through. That's what I assumed about it for a very long time, because I haven't really been that into the medieval or early modern period of Middle Eastern history. Been much more interested in the modern, past 100 years or so of Middle Eastern history, which is jam-packed with excitement of one kind or another. But the result is that I'm a bit ignorant about this particular region, and so a couple weeks ago, I decided, since it was a weak spot for me, to just do some research on it, do a little reading, a little Wikipedia diving, a little Googling, what have you. And so I kind of drew up a rough picture of the Armenian Highlands and the areas that are the most relevant in terms of the region's military history, and maybe to a lesser degree its economic history. So if you don't know anything about the Armenian Highlands, you're in luck, because I've created some maps here just to kind of give you an idea of where the action historically has been centered, so that you can have some idea, if you ever do read about a conflict that happens in this region or that happened in this region, you'll be able to have a rough idea of what the relevant place names are and where the major events are happening. So some of these maps just are an outline of historical Armenia. There's kind of different definitions of what constitutes the Armenian Highlands and Armenia. As you'll see, I have 3 different maps with 3 very different outlines of what constitutes the Armenian Highlands. But in general, it's this region roughly where Iran, Turkey, and Armenia all meet each other, and then the area around that, roughly speaking. Sometimes areas beyond that are included. Historically, ethnic Armenians have lived kind of in what is now Adana, basically the sort of southeastern coast of Turkey. So some maps include that in the Armenian Highlands, even though that's actually a lowland. Regardless, what you really want to learn about if you want to get into the geography of this region is rivers. Rivers are the big thing, because like I said, it's extremely rugged terrain. So there's not a whole lot of places you can go if you want to pass through it. Rivers are the best bet because, one, if you travel along a river, you have a source of drinking water, which is very handy, especially if you have a huge-ass army with you. And 2, it's useful because rivers naturally carve paths through mountains and hills and whatnot. So generally, when all else fails, you can walk alongside a river, and generally it'll be walkable. And that is generally the case in this region. So the main avenues of advance for armies moving in and out of the region have been along the major rivers. And because it is relatively high altitude and mountainous, there are a pretty good number of those rivers. I should also add the climate is relatively wet. I think we talked before about the Zagros Mountains in Persia, in Iran, and how they're relatively dry. So they don't really have a lot of major rivers in them. The Armenian Highlands, by contrast, get a fair amount more rain, and so it's a bit more wet. So the rivers are the main thing to learn, and I'll kind of walk you through, I think, the three main ones that I found. But also relevant are the major lakes. There's actually three large lakes in the Armenian Highlands that have historically been centers of population and that have themselves generally attracted significant attention during military campaigns. These are called historically the Armenian Seas. So I read. One of them is Lake Sevan, which is in Armenia. It's just north of the capital, Yerevan. Another one is Lake Van, that's in eastern Turkey. And then there's Lake Urmia in northwestern Iran. Lake Van is interesting because it's almost completely surrounded by fairly steep mountains. It's actually pretty hard to get to. It's relatively densely populated along its coastline, but immediately beyond that, the terrain gets very, very difficult. So there's not a whole lot of entry points into the Lake Van area, which has made it a pretty decent fortified area for defending countries that have controlled that terrain. Lake Urmia, by contrast, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, Lake Urmia, by contrast, is relatively flat. Well, that is to say, the land around the lake is relatively flat, much less rugged. Also, the altitude of the lake is also much lower. It's kind of sort of in the Armenian Highlands, and what I mean by that is most of the highlands are very high elevation, but then in northwestern Iran, they significantly decline in elevation very quickly. And so there is kind of a foothill region of the highlands in northwestern Iran that is much lower altitude, and that's more where Lake Urmia is.
I think I have the map open that has the lakes on it. There are three. The largest one looks like it's in the southeast, and then there's one that's like second largest, about in the center of the map you gave me, and then there's a smaller one to the north. This map is not in English, though.
Yeah, I think I know the one you got. Let me try to bring that up real quick. Yeah, they form a rough triangle shape between them. So the northern one would be Lake Sevan, the western one would be Lake Van, and then the eastern one would be Lake Urmia.
Cool.
Okay. It's gonna come up. Oh, here we go. Yeah, this is the one. Not in English, right?
Mm-hmm. It looks very detailed, though. You can kind of see the topographical features.
Yeah, this is probably the best map I found. So you can kind of see how there's a constellation of plains interspersed throughout the highlands.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part, it's very mountainous, but you can see the more lightly colored areas. Those are more the plains. And those are the areas that you're going to travel through if you're a merchant, an army, or just a traveler.
Mm-hmm. And some of these maps looks like you drew on them. Is that what you're doing with the main?
So what I did is I identified the main areas that kind of came up when I was reading about Persia's wars with the Romans and the Byzantines, and then also the what was it? The Ottoman wars with the Safavid Empire, I think is what it was called, which were in the 1600s. So in those conflicts, certain particular planes seem to come up a lot. They seem to be the most strategic, the ones they fought over more. And so I wanted to try to highlight those areas to try to give you an idea of the main vectors of advance between the two warring sides, to give you an idea of which areas were the most important. So those were the areas that I tried to highlight in the ones that I drew on.
Cool. So you have like a dark blue section. I'm guessing these are the navigable routes through the highlands.
Yeah. So you can see there that just northwest of Lake Van, which is the western lake of the triangle of lakes, north of that is a big plain. So that's roughly where the Battle of Manzikert happened, which was a major battle that did not destroy the Byzantine Empire, but sort of marked its terminal decline. So that area, because it's a big plain, kind of attracts armies, because that's an area where you can fight without having to get bottlenecked in a mountain pass or something.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it's easier to get to, because you can go from Iran northwest into that sort of flat area, and then follow that sort of western connection into that plain north of Lake Van. And then you can also go further north into what is now Armenia. So that northern area is actually where a river called the Aras River is located. And the Aras River goes from roughly the western part of that northern path I highlighted all the way east to the Caspian Sea.
That's the light blue line you drew?
Yeah, there's another one where I drew the rivers. So that's the light blue.
Gotcha. I would guess that river is like a thing for both military and for trade.
Correct. In fact, the Silk Road actually ran along that as well. And because the land around the river was relatively low, it was the path of least resistance. So the Silk Road ran from roughly the city of Tabriz, which is actually very close to Lake Urmia, which is the eastern lake in the triangle of lakes I mentioned. So the Silk Road ran next to Lake Urmia and then north through this route and then along the Aras River and then west into Anatolia.
Cool.
So that valley here that's connecting sort of Anatolia and Persia, that's Armenia, that's the Aras Valley, and that's very valuable real estate. There's other paths you could take to kind of travel between Turkey and Iran, but because the Silk Road ran through that particular area, it was the one that seems to have been the one that was the most contested. Because if you got that, then you would get significantly more tax revenue from the Silk Road trade.
Mm-hmm. Chat saying there's a mission for this. It's the pre-Ottoman Turks versus the Byzantines in Age of Empires.
I guess I need to play more Age of Empires so I can learn more.
Hey, don't say games never taught you anything. That's cool when they put actual history in it.
Yeah, I think I had a third map where I had the arrows in it.
Yeah, they're
the green arrows.
Yeah, I have that one up now.
Yeah, so this illustrates very clearly where the action is happening. So the topmost arrow, that goes through the Armenian Aras plain and then goes west. And if you look at the top arrow, the western part of that arrow terminates at a city that's called Erzurum. You can't really see it because I drew over it, but the city with the name that's kind of partially covered up, that's Erzurum. And that's an old city that was originally founded by the Byzantines that used to be called Theodosiopolis. But then after the Turks conquered it, they renamed it Erzurum. If you're curious, the reason they called it Erzurum is because the Turkish peoples that were invading, as well as the broader Muslim world for that matter, called this whole area Rum, which was basically their word for Roman. And when the Turks first conquered central Anatolia, the kingdom they set up was actually called the Rum Sultanate, which basically translated roughly as the Roman Sultanate. So Erzurum here is basically named after the Romans. So Erzurum is important because that was basically the main fortress on the eastern border of the Ottoman Empire with the Persians. So whenever the Turks went to war with the Persians, generally their army would go to Erzurum first, and then they would progress east along the Aras River into Persia.
So taking the green arrow south and east.
Exactly.
Cool.
Erzurum is important also just in terms of its location vis-a-vis rivers. So you can see the Aras River is very close to it. And so obviously being able to go just downstream the river is much easier than going upstream. So that's an easy way to travel. But then east of Erzurum, you can see another river, which runs west and then south. So that's the Karasis River, I think. And that's a major tributary to the Euphrates River. Yeah, you can see the Euphrates River kind of at the bottom coming up, and then there's two rivers that connect to it. One is the Karasis, which has its headwaters near Erzurum, and then the other one is Murat River. And you can see that the Murat is actually connected to that plain northwest of Lake Van. So if you're Persian and you're moving west into Anatolia, it really behooves you to move, if you have a multi-pronged invasion anyway, you can send one army up the Aras River to Erzurum and then you would be able to push along the Karasis River west into Anatolia. And then you could have another army go west to the north of Lake Van, enter the plain north of Lake Van, and then follow the Murat River west into the Anatolian plain at the same time. These would be your two main avenues.
Cool. There's something that chat's a little bit excited about here. There's a city called Batman.
You noticed.
Yes.
There is a city called Batman in the area. It's not quite in the Armenian Highlands. It's sort of in the foothill area southwest of the Highlands. This is actually where a lot of Kurdish people live in Turkey. You can see west of Batman is Diyarbakir. That's, I believe, the largest city in southeastern Turkey. And it's a major center of Kurds, major Kurdish population center, I should say.
And how far is Batman from Gotham? Got to get these in when I can.
I could not tell you.
Okay.
Probably several thousand miles,
Okay.
I would guess. Yeah, historically, and actually I found this out too while I was researching this, historically Mesopotamia was part of Persia for like 1,000 years. So it's almost always been Persian. It didn't stop being part of Persia and the Persian Empire until the early 1500s, when the Ottoman Empire successfully defeated the Safavid Empire at the Battle of, I think it was Chaldiran. And they pushed into Mesopotamia, and I might add, also pushed into much of Western Iran. It was a very successful war for the Ottoman Empire.
What were the advantages of the Ottomans that allowed them to take so much territory? Like some military tech breakthrough or just really good administration?
Their empire was larger. The Persian population was actually much smaller than theirs. The Persians were disproportionately dependent on the Silk Road. And over the course of time, especially by the early modern period, the value of the Silk Road trade declined significantly because transoceanic trade began to supplant it.
Oh.
And so that hurt them, financially, to the point where they basically could barely compete on equal terms with surrounding empires. The Ottoman Empire also had an advantage organizationally, like its administration and institutions were just much stronger, much more well-developed. The Persians were kind of more dependent on like mercenaries and more decentralized authority. The Ottomans, by contrast, were much more centralized and also had a professional warrior caste called the Janissaries, which were pretty much at the beck and call of the emperor 24/7, not the emperor, I should say the sultan, whatever his name was. And they were a much more effective fighting force. Also, as you say, technology. I was reading at the Battle of Chaldiran, one of the decisive factors was the fact that the Persians did not have any artillery, and the Ottomans did.
What kind of artillery?
Basically just light field artillery. The battle happened, I want to say, 1500s, thereabouts. So I don't think artillery was all that advanced by that point.
Does that mean cannons or trebuchets?
Oh, cannons, for sure.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it wasn't just European empires or Chinese, for that matter, that had gunpowder weapons. There were a couple what were called gunpowder empires, sort of in the Middle East and South Asia. The Mughal Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and to a lesser degree, the Persian Empire, all had access to gunpowder weaponry. Yeah, Persia, for its part, really struggled with invasions by Central Asian Turkish peoples, and so their shit kind of got fucked up a lot back in the day. It kind of destabilized them and made it very difficult for them to stay organized and have any kind of continuity in terms of governance. Some of those Turkish empires were sort of stronger and better organized than others, but the one that was running Persia in the 1500s was kind of haberdash. It was basically some religious extremists that managed to fight their way into power. That was actually why they were fighting Turkey at the time, the Ottoman Empire, rather. There were a number of Turkish peoples living in the eastern Anatolian regions of the Ottoman Empire, which actually had more in common religiously with the Shiite Turkish people running Iran at that point than they did with the Ottoman Empire, which was famously a Sunni empire. And so the Persians tried to take advantage of that by trying to get the sort of like-minded Shia peoples in eastern Anatolia to revolt, which actually did happen and spurred the conflict that the Persians subsequently lost. To go back to that arrow map, there's a third arrow beneath the top two, and that just goes directly from Persia to Lake Van. There is actually a small plain to the east of Lake Van, and that's actually where the Battle of Chaldiran happened. Again, that's the decisive battle that allowed the Ottoman Empire to pretty decisively defeat the Persian Empire and seize Mesopotamia for the first time.
Yeah, they should have called for help from Batman.
Yeah, no such luck. But yeah, this is pretty much what it looks like. The wars between Turkish and Persian peoples have generally been along one of these three vectors.
Cool. I didn't know any of this.
Well, neither did I until recently, and I'm still learning. I'm a neophyte myself. But just to kind of summarize, again, the Armenian Highlands is basically a constellation of plains and valleys interconnected by rivers. And there's any number of ways you can traverse it, but the ones that attract the most attention in terms of the economy and militarily have been along the Aras River and then around the major lakes in the area, because that's where the Silk Road basically ran through.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Part of the map that we didn't know shit about. Thank you.
Yeah, that area that has Batman and Diyarbakir, that's kind of a transition zone culturally between the Arab part of Mesopotamia and the Armenian Highlands, which has played host to obviously Armenians, but also Kurds and various Turkish peoples. Yeah, you might wonder, I actually was wondering why there didn't seem to be as much military action in that region. I would have thought if you're a Persian invading the Ottoman Empire, then why wouldn't you start around Diyarbakir and then just move north or west into the Anatolian plateau in the middle of Anatolia? But that doesn't seem to have happened much. I think instead they prefer to invade along the coast. I don't think you can see it in any of the maps I have, but the Ottoman Empire, well, the Persian Empire before them, controlled the Levant, which is sort of where Israel and Lebanon are now. And generally empires invading Anatolia, rather than going north along the Euphrates, have preferred a more coastal route that starts in some place like Lebanon and then runs into present-day Adana, southeastern coastal Turkey, and then tries to move along the coast rather than trying to cross a bunch of rugged terrain to the north. It does kind of make sense. It's just logistically difficult to traverse rugged terrain. And most of the most valuable parts of Anatolia are along the coasts anyway. The Anatolian plateau in the middle of Anatolia is valuable, not because there's anything inherently valuable in it. There's not as much population density, not as much agriculture, etc. Its strategic value just lay in the fact that you pretty much have access to every coastal region of Anatolia from the center. And so you can kind of strike anywhere. But at the same time, if you're going to launch an expensive war and you don't know if you're going to succeed, going for Anatolia maybe ensures you get something, but that something is not going to be very valuable. So if you're going to gamble, you might as well gamble trying to take something that is valuable. And the nearest valuable thing is going to be southeastern coastal Turkey, again, the Adana area. So I think that's maybe why Persian armies or Arab armies before them preferred that invasion route rather than the Euphrates.
Yeah, if you're playing a zero-sum war game where you're breaking stuff and taking stuff, you have to make sure that the stuff that you're taking is valuable enough to cover the cost of the war, and then ideally some see profit.
Yeah, the Armenian Highlands would not qualify if not for the Silk Road, if not for all that trade moving through it. Like, the region itself just doesn't have a lot of wealth otherwise. It's fairly barren.
Mm-hmm.
Also, fun fact, almost the entire area I've been talking about here was originally populated mostly, or later on, in large part, by ethnic Armenians. You can probably guess what happened to them.
They were attacked and killed?
Have you ever heard of the Armenian genocide?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what happened to them. They were
Who is it?
systematically annihilated.
Who is it who is doing that to them?
Ottoman Empire, early 20th century, during World War One.
Gotcha.
I had always heard about it, but I really didn't know anything about the geography of it. And so the more I looked into it, the more I realized just how expansive Armenian culture was in the region. Even as it was mostly Muslim, you know, with Kurds and Turks and whatnot, there was still a significant Christian Armenian minority. So systematically erasing them actually significantly changed the cultural landscape of the Armenian Highlands. You know, before there would have always been it would have always been very multicultural, basically. But now it's much, much less so on account of the genocide. And the extent of Armenian culture now is much more narrow. It's much more focused in just what is now Armenia, which is basically just a small rump state of what used to be a much more expansive Armenian reach in the highlands.
Sorry, did you say rump state?
Yeah, rump state.
Like
it's
Djibouti?
No, not like Djibouti. Djibouti is not a rump state. A rump state is basically just a smaller bit of territory carved out of what had been a larger territory. So, you know, if you invade a country and then you decide to keep most of the territory but leave some of it for the original government, the remaining territory and the government that controls it would be referred to as a rump state.
Gotcha. At least I got in a butt joke. I've been on fire today. A butt joke, Batman joke. We're killing it.
Well done.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could say that the only reason there's any Armenians left at all is because of Russian imperialism. The Russians, over the course of the 1800s, pushed into the Caucasus and successfully pried away part of Armenia from the Ottoman Empire. And the result of that is that there was a kind of haven for ethnic Armenians where they were protected and lived in a Christian kingdom that was not discriminating against them. And so a lot of the survivors of the Armenian genocide ended up taking advantage of that and seeking refuge in Russian Armenia. It's one of the reasons that Armenians have a generally favorable view of Russians, even to the present day.
Did not know that either.
Yeah, that was one of that was actually an excuse that the Russians had for Russian imperialism in the Caucasus. You know, really they were just expanding like empires do, but of course it's always very couth to have an excuse, and their excuse of choice was that we're protecting the Christian minorities of the region.
Mm-hmm. We're not like those other imperialists. We're nice imperialists.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Actually, more interesting trivia about the Armenian genocide. In the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was experiencing a kind of nationalist awakening. You know, maybe you've heard of the Young Turks before. That was a nationalist group of officers in the Ottoman Empire that wanted to reform the empire so that it could keep pace with rivals in Europe. They wanted to create a single national identity, but that's very difficult to do in a multicultural state like the Ottoman Empire. And so there was this question of what to do with the Armenians in particular, and to a lesser degree, the other Christian peoples like the Greeks. And the Armenians in particular got focused because during a mid-19th century war with the Russians, the Armenians in eastern Anatolia actually sided with the Russians. The Armenians saw the Russian invasion as a liberation, and so they actually actively helped the invasion. And that created a lot of paranoia, as you might imagine, amongst officials and generals in the Ottoman Empire's government. And so the result is that there came to be what was called the Armenian question, which is, what do we do about these fucking Armenians? And if it sounds familiar, it should, because it's an exact corollary to what was called the Jewish question in the late 19th century, when a lot of nationalism was emerging in most of Europe, and people were questioning how they could create a national identity if they had all these minorities. And Jews in particular were singled out as a particularly difficult group to grapple with because they kind of had their own pre-existing identity. So the question was, is it possible to assimilate this large Jewish minority? Can these people be made into nationalists that assimilate? I think most people familiar with the Holocaust and anti-Semitism in Europe are familiar with the Jewish question, but maybe less familiar with the Armenian question. I actually just learned about this. It was pretty much exactly the same, but the context was in the Ottoman Empire instead, and it had to do with a Christian minority. And perhaps unsurprisingly, it turned out pretty much the same way as the Jewish question, unfortunately.
Roughly how many people were looking for a place to be?
How many people were displaced in the Armenian genocide?
Yeah.
I'd have to look it up. I don't know the number off the top of my head. I know that a relatively high proportion of the ethnic Armenian population in the region was decimated, that is to say, was killed. But I don't have the exact numbers on me.
Gotcha.
I'm sure somebody in chat probably knows.
I think System of a Down is Armenian.
Every time we talk about Armenians, somebody brings up that band.
Hey, they're a pretty good band.
It's like clockwork. Whenever it comes up, I know I'm going to hear that band sooner or later.
It's only a matter of time. Hey, we went a pretty long time talking about the Armenian Highlands, and I didn't say anything.
Fair point.
But I knew.
Touché.
Chat, press 1 if you like that band. I bet lots of people do.
Have you heard of Georgia? The country, not the state?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's northwest of Armenia. And that's actually another Christian kingdom that the Russians kind of pretensed to be liberating. They'd actually been part of Persia for most of their history, or more accurately, one or the other Persian Empire. And by the time the Russians got to them, they'd been part of the Ottoman Empire for, I don't know, like 200 years, something like that. So they were spared any kind of genocide because pretty much the entirety of Georgia ended up in the Russian Empire. So they very much kind of dodged a bullet in that regard. But I bring it up because the Georgians actually have kind of a similar affinity for Russia as that between the Armenians and Russians because of that sort of historical liberation as it was viewed at the time. I would add, though, that being part of the Persian Empire was not the worst thing, because the Persians were, from what I've read, way more chill than the Ottomans ever were.
Yeah, in the movie 300, Xerxes said that he was a gracious god.
Well, I don't know how representative 300 was of Persian norms of administration. Certainly, the Persians have a long history of relatively decentralized, flexible governance that is not very heavy-handed. I'm sure they've had their periods. I think I've read about a few now. But for the most part, if you were an ethnic or religious minority in the Persian Empire, you were probably treated overall better than if you were living in the Ottoman Empire. So the Georgians, I think, benefited from that. I don't think they had nearly as much negative experiences in the Persian Empire. And I think there's relatively more cultural affinity, too, that stems out of that. I think there's still some residual Persian influence over Georgian culture stemming from the period when they were a part of the Persian empires. Not a lot, mind you. They have their own language, their own writing system, but some of the traditional forms of clothing, some of the music, for example, that has some Persian influence. I would point out, too, that Iran itself actually, well, partly voluntarily, partly not voluntarily, experienced significant inflows of Georgian migration during various periods of its history. I say involuntary because there actually was one Persian empire a few hundred years ago that forcibly relocated large numbers of Georgians from Georgia into Iran. I think specifically because he wanted to create a new constituency in Iranian politics that would be more loyal to the emperor than to the nobles, basically, who were rival centers of power. And so as a result, and also as a result of just natural migration, because there was a lot of that happening too, there ended up being a sizable number of Georgians in Persia. Most of them assimilated and converted over time, but there's still some residual cultural influence. So you wouldn't necessarily know it if you looked at a map of religions or ethnicity, but genetically, there's actually quite a few descendants of Georgians in Persia or Iran today on account of that.
I think you did get a couple other questions too.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Any Myanmar updates? I don't have anything on Myanmar. I've not read anything in the past month or two. So unfortunately, no updates there. Do you think you would be able to do a US president tier list? I probably don't know enough about US presidents to do like a full tier list. I could stumble my way through it, but
that question came up a little bit ago because I think we were talking about who the best presidents were. I'm near Mount Rushmore, so the ones that are carved into the rock are George Washington, Theodore Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln. And those are generally seen as some of our best presidents. And then there's Andrew Jackson I was talking about recently because he was like a super loose cannon violent president.
Yeah.
And he showed up in a list that I think was voted on in the 70s or 80s. And they ranked him 7th best president that we've had. So I don't know why, but...
You want to know why?
Why?
Universal suffrage. He was the guy that pushed that and passed it.
Oh.
So whatever else he did, he probably more than any other president in U.S. history expanded the vote.
Oh. Chat saying he also had great hair.
I will not dispute them.
Trail of Tears as well. Yeah, I would need like a pitch tier where for this president, I don't know anything about them, so it's not really fair for me to say that they were good or bad. And we did have quite a few presidents, I think, who weren't really notable in the sense that they didn't really change much at all.
Yeah, we certainly have had quite a few of those. I think the late 19th century would be especially difficult for me, if not most people my age, because those presidents tend to be a little nameless. Mm-hmm. Nameless and faceless. Yeah, who was after Abraham Lincoln? That would have been Andrew Johnson, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then after Johnson, who I think only had one term, everybody hated him, there was Ulysses Grant, the Civil War general, and he had 2 terms, I think. And people liked him, but his administration was just corrupt as fuck and pretty much garbage. So I think after that is where things start getting blurry. Let's see, I think his second term ended in the 1870s. I want to say after Grant was Hayes, Rutherford Hayes. And then maybe Harrison.
In what way was Grant corrupt?
He himself was not perceived to be corrupt. The issue is that because he was so inexperienced with politics, he didn't really know how to judge people when he was selecting people for his cabinet. And so the result is that he just ended up selecting like extremely corrupt, self-interested people into positions of authority in his administration.
Gotcha.
And they basically just stole everything that wasn't nailed down, just abusing government authority left and right for their own personal interest and the interest of anybody who could afford to bribe them.
So I'm guessing he was a pretty proficient war guy, but when it comes to the silver-tongued politicians who know all the loopholes, he has no fucking clue.
Exactly. That was pretty much his problem. Everybody liked him because he helped win the war, but those martial skills did not translate well to the political sphere. Mm-hmm. And he suffered for it. Yeah, I want to say it was Hayes, Harrison, Cleveland? Grover Cleveland was the last guy that had non-consecutive terms. So I want to say it was like Cleveland, somebody else, and then Cleveland again. And then I think maybe McKinley after that. How off base am I here?
Hayes, Garfield, Arthur.
Arthur, okay.
Someone posted the list. I'll copy paste it to the list.
Gotcha. Hayes, Garfield, Arthur. I totally forgot about Arthur. And I think Garfield was the one that got shot. Yeah, what was it? It's Kennedy got shot, Lincoln got shot, Garfield was shot, and then McKinley was shot.
Teddy Roosevelt was also shot, but his armor class was too high, so he absorbed the damage.
And then died. Roosevelt was too tough.
Yep. Roosevelt's a big name out here in South Dakota because I think he lived here for some period of time, and he also established a lot of the national parks and stuff. So anyone who is pro forest and nature stuff is gonna have a soft spot for Teddy Roosevelt. I also just like the physical badass kind of president archetype. I think it's cool if you're physically in shape, you're able to take some damage and advocate for yourself. Make the bull moose party, get shot, keep talking. He doesn't give a fuck.
Okay, so it was Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland, and then McKinley. Okay. And then we get into the 20th century. Yeah, Harrison, what's his first? Benjamin Harrison. He was actually related to the previous President Harrison. Where was he? Yeah, William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison was the president that died immediately after taking office because he gave the speech in the rain and got the flu and then just got really sick. Yeah, he didn't last like a month or so. So I'm sure he would be delighted to know that I guess his grandson would end up becoming president. And unlike his predecessor, he actually did serve the full term. Yeah, Cleveland was the only Democrat during this period. Out of the entire late 19th century, after Grant anyway, Cleveland was the only Democrat. And he won because he was a progressive reformist.
And the political orientation of the Republicans and the Democrats flipped at some point, right?
Yes, but that's relatively recent. That was in the 1970s, pretty much.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So back at this time, sort of the traditional alignment was still in place. So the South was still solidly Democratic. And it was more the Midwest and Northeast that voted Republican. Because those were the big centers of business. And so, of course, everybody voted the pro-business party. But the Democrats were making headway in the Northeast and some in the Midwest, in the urban areas by way of the progressive movement, which was then emerging. They were the big proponents of reform, and Grover Cleveland was their most successful proponent. I do not remember anything about Chester Arthur, though. I have no idea. I'm guessing he took office after Garfield was shot. I guess that would be the only thing I would know about him. Yeah, I know more about the other presidents. Like post-Revolutionary War America, I know more about those presidents. The lead up to the Civil War, and then the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, and then the 20th century, obviously, I'm very familiar with. But yeah, that late 19th century period, just like a bunch of old white guys with beards. They all just kind of blend together until you start really getting into the politics of the era.
Just one big beard.
One big beard, yeah. Well, how are we doing on time?
I've got another 20, 30 minutes.
Gotcha. I don't know that I really have anything else that I could do in 2030. There's not really any big breakthroughs anywhere.
I am down for a spot of Heroes of the Storm after, if you want to as well.
I'm definitely game for that.
I think I'm like a few games away from getting the bundle of heroes.
Yeah, 1 or 2. I think you were at 24 last time.
Yeah.
And we could probably get you over the finish line tonight.
Dota's been really fun. The thing that's crazy about that game is like how weak-willed and unsportsmanlike the players are, even up to a high level of skill. It's insane to me.
Yeah, I can't tolerate it. You have much more patience than me. I don't even try. Some more credit to you.
Yeah, I'm just a masochist, so it's not really something to brag about.
Let's see. Any particular region you wanted to get to? Something you wanted to ask about?
How's Australia and that area?
Actually, Neuro, you could talk a little bit about that. Obviously, there was the election recently, so the center-left won that after they were expected to do much worse. But beyond that, there was actually something else that happened, and I actually have a picture for you. A map, more accurately. If I can find it. I really ought to start putting my notes in some kind of database application. It would make it much easier to navigate. Let's see. Cook Islands. Is this it? Yeah. I think this is it. So what happened is that in February of this year, there was a Chinese fleet, a small one, relatively speaking, that actually had some exercises in the Tasman Sea. What did I do? Oh, there it is. I'll send you this map here. And not only did they have exercises in the Tasman Sea, which is notable because it's roughly between Australia and New Zealand. You know, somebody's going to bitch me out for that. Roughly, that's where it is. Which is quite the sensitive area, right? That's very clearly the Chinese government sending a signal. And then they sailed west rather than going back the direction that they'd come from, and sailed all the way around Australia before turning north and going back to China. So that was considered quite provocative. There we go. Here's a map of the path they took, and then roughly where the games were. Exercises, not games, sorry. I would point out it was totally legal for them to do this because they were in international waters.
They were just really aggressively driving.
Yeah. Well, live fire exercises are kind of provocative, like in the best of circumstances, but especially when you sail thousands of miles and then have them right next to a major city of a country that perceives you as a rival. That especially is very provocative. Mm-hmm. So they didn't break any rules or anything, but it was seen as an intimidation tactic. Because, you know, while they could do it in international waters, you're generally supposed to give forewarning, especially if it's in an area where there's a lot of air traffic. They didn't do that, so when the war games started up, it ended up disrupting a bunch of air traffic in the area. But beyond that, there was no further disruption, and once the exercise concluded, they just sailed away. But it's more just the geography of it that kind of put people off. Mm-hmm. And also the fact that it had just never really happened before. I also read in the article about this that Australian naval strategy emphasizes defenses in the north of Australia. So most of their naval infrastructure and assets are located up there. Southeastern Australia is relatively undefended. They kind of share responsibility for defending that with New Zealand, and they don't really have a lot of assets deployed there. And so the fact that the Chinese kind of took advantage of that and explicitly had an exercise and held an exercise in a weak area for their naval defenses also just kind of made it worse. Mm-hmm. That itself was probably a signal on their part. This is a thing we can do now.
Seems like pretty expensive fuel costs to go around the whole of Australia.
Well, that's the price you pay for having a blue water navy. You're going to have to go on some long hauls. I think there's also been some shenanigans with the Cook Islands. Let me see if I can find that. Yeah, so I don't know if you've ever heard of the Cook Islands, but it's an island country in the Oceania region. Mm-hmm. And I had thought that it was an independent country until I read about this, and it turns out that it's kind of an independent country. Well, no, sorry, other way around. I had thought this was a British overseas territory, and it turns out that it is actually an independent country, but it has what's called a Compact of Free Association with New Zealand. We've talked about compacts of free association before. These are the kinds of agreements the United States has with Micronesia, Palau, and the Marshall Islands. So for a quick review, the United States has responsibility for the defense of these countries and also controls explicitly their foreign policy. And in exchange, the United States gives them, that is to say the native population of these places, the right to travel to the United States and work freely. Also, the United States gives them some money for infrastructure and social programs and some of that kind of stuff. So it's a mutually beneficial arrangement. I was unaware that New Zealand had the same arrangement with the Cook Islands. Again, I thought the Cook Islands were just a territory. My mistake. But as it happens, the Cook Islands has a government. Well, certain elements in the Cook Islands government would like the Cook Islands to be more independent and more sovereign. And they've actually been negotiating with the Chinese government to try to have a more direct relationship with them rather than having that relationship be arbitrated by the New Zealand government. And so there was a big kerfuffle a couple months ago when the Cook Islands actually negotiated an agreement, a bilateral agreement with the Chinese government. And some people were very upset about that, and it kind of implied further Chinese influence peddling in the Oceania region, rather. I cannot pronounce that to save my life. So it covered a lot of different things: infrastructure, agriculture, deep sea mineral exploration, shipbuilding, tourism, technology, education. There wasn't any debt involved, either giving it or taking it. And there wasn't any kind of security guarantee. There's no mutual defense clause or anything like that. This is a very kind of bare bones, minimal agreement. Basically just an agreement to cooperate on some economic issues of one kind or another. Also, China agreed to give them diplomatic support in multinational forums. So, for example, the Cook Islands wants to join certain international organizations that it's currently not in because New Zealand basically doesn't let them because of the Compact of Free Association. New Zealand claims to represent them in those organizations on their behalf. The Cook Islands government, or at least, again, certain hawkish elements within it, would like that to change and would like to have just their own representatives in those organizations. China, as part of this series of agreements, has agreed to support them in that endeavor. Let's see, and then there was some memorandums of understanding that were signed as well, although notably the details of those were not released publicly, which had a lot of people on edge, especially in Washington. So the Cook Islands government went out of its way to note that it was not cutting ties with New Zealand. This was just more about exploring new relationships and trying to build new relationships that were beneficial to the Cook Islands. The opposition in the Cook Islands very quickly jumped on this, especially the lack of transparency. He actually, that is to say, the government faced a no confidence vote in fairly short order. I believe it survived that vote, but that does illustrate that this is not an uncontroversial move on the part of the government. So yet another example of China trying to build relations with island countries in the Pacific Ocean, a region that has traditionally been the purview of the United States and Australia. Correspondingly, this deal with the Cook Islands is probably going to spur more money to be spent by both Washington and Canberra in order to try to deflect it to some degree. Is it Canberra or Canberra? I think somebody in chat told me once it was Canberra. So yeah, a little bit of geopolitics in the Pacific Ocean for you.
Cool. What is Tasmania doing?
Oh, they're just chilling. I don't think it's like an especially wealthy part of Australia. Lots of screeching Tasmanian devils. I think they're still around.
Those are cool.
You ever seen video of those?
I think I have, yeah.
Yeah, they're very loud, intimidating animals. It kind of belies their small size.
The mongoose is kind of like that.
Huh?
The mongoose is kind of like that. Very small, but fast and ferocious.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't think the mongoose really makes a lot of noise, though.
No.
That's the difference for me. If I were an early European explorer off the coast of Tasmania at night, and I just heard Tasmanian devils screeching without knowing what a Tasmanian devil was, I would for sure never step foot on that fucking island.
Pass. I'll pass on that one.
Hard pass. Oh, are you in game?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's do... What do you know about Central Asia?
Not too much.
Okay. So there's 5 countries in Central Asia. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. All 5 of them were part of the Soviet Union, and then later broke away when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s. Now, the results of them being part of the Soviet Union and then part of the Russian Empire for 50, 70 years before that, the result of that is that the elites in these Central Asian countries tend to speak Russian. That's not to say that they're ethnically Russian. They tend to be ethnically Turkish of one kind or another. Kazakh, Uzbek, Turkmen, and Kyrgyz are all different types of Turkish ethnicity. So most of the elites now are of those ethnic groups, but because they were frequently educated in, Soviet educational institutions, generally they were educated in Russian. And Russian during the Russian period was obviously a prestige language. So if you wanted to advance your career, it behooved you to learn it. So, they've been trying to kind of push native languages since then, but it's still very common for people who are educated to still speak Russian, including like online and whatnot. It's still kind of a prestige dialect. The exception to the Turkish rule is Tajikistan. Tajikistan is actually a Persian ethnicity. It's distinct in the region on that count. The whole region used to be ethnically Persian. In fact, I think it's the origin territory for Persian peoples everywhere. But over the course of millennia, a whole variety of Turkish groups of one kind or another have invaded and settled in it, to the point where most of it is now Turkish. Let's see. I'm trying to remember the two rivers. You've probably heard of the Aral Sea, right? That's the big sea that has been destroyed because of pollution and irrigation and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there are two big rivers that feed into that stem from the mountains in the eastern part of Central Asia. I think one of them is called the Amu Darya, and then the other one is Amu Sira. Yeah, again, I don't quite remember. The ancient Greeks called the area Transoxiana, and they have their own names for the two rivers, but those are easily the two largest rivers in the region. And they're pretty significant centers of population because obviously farmers have settled along the rivers and used the water therein for irrigation. And then the Caspian Sea is on the western part of this region. But there's not a lot going on there because it's mostly desert. The northern part of Central Asia, specifically Central Asia as defined as this 5 countries, is very dry and semi-arid. And that semi-arid region extends into the western part of the territory along the coast of the Caspian Sea. So there's very few people there, relatively speaking. I think beyond that, the major population centers are more closer to the mountains in the east. That's generally where you see, for example, Dushanbe, the capital of Tajikistan, and I don't remember the capital of Kyrgyzstan. I think it was Kizil or something like that. But the mountainous region there, while it is more rugged terrain, also has a more mild climate. And some of the valleys that the rivers that have their headwaters in the mountains form are relatively fertile. And so there's relatively more people correspondingly. I think the poorest of the 5 countries is Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Their economies are disproportionately dependent on migrant labor in Russia. In other words, their workers travel to Russia for work and then they'll send money back home. And so that remittance money is a big chunk of the local economies there. If you look at a map, you'll see Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are just like very small mountainous countries with small populations. So, they don't have a whole lot going on for them. They're relatively isolated geographically. Transportation costs are high. There is some history of mining, but after the Soviet Union collapsed, they lost subsidies, and so they became relatively less competitive. And so they've been struggling since then on that count. To the west of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. They've done much better because they have much larger resources of natural gas and oil. Turkmenistan in particular has a large reserve of natural gas, and they are actually one of the largest suppliers of natural gas in the region. I think they even sell a lot to Europe, although I think it has to go through a bunch of pipelines that run through Turkey and some through Russia, if I remember correctly. Turkmenistan is in that really dry region in coastal next to the coastal Caspian. So the land there in particular is mostly desert and is very dry. So the population there is correspondingly very small. I think it's only like 5 million people or something like that. It's tiny. But because they have so much energy, the government there is relatively cash rich. Unfortunately, their political history after the collapse of the Soviet Union is pretty mixed. They've had some of the most eccentric dictators, specifically the one that ruled for most of the period after the collapse of the Soviet Union was a guy who called himself Turkmenbashi, which translates as Father of the Turks. And he basically just renamed everything in the country after him. He even renamed months of the year in the calendar after him and his family. Just crazy, eccentric shit like that. He's since died, and they've had more of a reformist guy come in, but he's also, despotic. So there's not really been a lot of representative democracy or anything that's resulted from the death of Turkmenbashi, unfortunately. Uzbekistan is a little different because they actually have one of those rivers. I think it's Amu Darya that runs through it. So they have more fertile land. In fact, the land there has historically been used to cultivate cotton since the Russians occupied it anyway. That's actually a big reason that the Aral Sea has declined so much. Cotton is a very thirsty crop, and so much water has had to be diverted from the Amu Darya in order to feed all of that cotton. that relatively little now reaches the Aral Sea, and so the sea has shrunk correspondingly. The cotton crop used to be the main economic activity. I think it still is, but it was so central during the Soviet period and during the 30 years after that the government actually forced people, up to and including educated people living in cities, to go and help with the harvest because that was seen as more important than anything else going on in the country. So a lot of people who have lived in Uzbekistan, even relatively recently, have stories about having to work in cotton fields, and not voluntarily. Yeah, the government in Uzbekistan has also been authoritarian, no shock, but not nearly as eccentric as Turkmenistan. They've tried to actually run the country in a more normal fashion. Also, Uzbekistan, despite not being the largest territorially of the 5 Central Asian states, is actually the most populous. I think their population is something like 20 to 30 million. The second largest state in the region is only about 15 million. So Uzbekistan is kind of considered the heavyweight power of the 5 Central Asian states because of that. If you're old enough, you might remember the United States actually had an air base in Uzbekistan during the early part of the War on Terror in a place called Andijan in eastern Uzbekistan. But the United States actually ended up leaving that air base over a massacre that occurred in eastern Uzbekistan. There were people protesting the government, and the government responded by massacring them. And the Bush administration was sufficiently put off by that they decided it was better to just leave. I think the other one, the 5th one, is Kazakhstan. That's probably the wealthiest one, second highest population. It's also the one that's maybe the most multicultural. Over the course of the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union afterwards, a whole litany of different varieties of ethnic groups that the government didn't trust, as well as dissidents, were actually forcibly relocated into Kazakhstan. So the result today is that while the population is mostly ethnically Kazakh, there's a whole bunch of ethnic Koreans, ethnic Chechens, ethnic Russians as well, that populate different parts of the country. So a surprising amount of diversity there. Also, the northernmost part of Kazakhstan actually overlaps with the Black Earth Belt that runs through central Siberia, which is heavily populated by ethnic Russians. And so correspondingly, the northern part of Kazakhstan is actually mostly ethnically Russian. And that's led to some concerns about irredentism. That is to say, the potential for either the Russian government to try to demand those territories, or for people living in those territories to demand to be allowed to join Russia. So that's created some tension, especially since the Russian government started its interference with Ukraine starting in 2014. That made a whole variety of countries along the border of Russia very concerned about potential Russian ambitions. And the Kazakh government has, as a result, kind of hedged its bets. It's still very close to Russia overall. Kazakhstan is actually a source of a huge amount of natural gas and oil, a good chunk of which is actually exported through Russia and then on into Europe. So it's kind of an important relationship for Russia to manage, but paranoia in the Kazakh government because of Russian hostility in Eastern Europe has somewhat undermined that relationship. Yeah, they had a leader that ruled for like 20 years, 30 years named Nazarbayev. I think he died relatively recently, but interestingly, before he did, he actually made some moves to try to liberalize governance. It's still fairly authoritarian, but much less so than, say, Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan. You know, there is some ambit for freedom of speech, and the government itself has tried to make moves towards something resembling a multi-party style of politics. So it's a pretty interesting region. You don't hear about it much, but it's pretty dynamic.
I know almost nothing about it. I saw one documentary like 10 years ago about kidnapping brides-to-be as a tradition in one of those countries. I can't remember which one it was.
I think Kazakhstan.
Yeah. And weirdly, Borat wasn't even set there. It was supposed to be about Kazakhstan, but it was some other country instead, I think, that looked more Arabic than Kazakh, which is more, they look more Asian, is the kind of ethnic makeup, is what it seems like to me.
In Central Asia, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, genetically, they look more Asian.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, it was sort of a main route for those Silk Roads. So while there has been a history of sedentary agriculture there, um, a lot of the cultures have been more caravan based, more based off of nomadic horse riding or nomadic merchants.
Mm-hmm. Maybe some influence from the Mongolian expansion.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually read recently that while the Mongols themselves obviously were a prominent part of those invasions, they actually recruited a lot of Turkish peoples that lived near Central Asia, and that maybe that was one of the reasons the region ended up Turkified, where before it had been Persian. Interestingly, even though most of the ethnic makeup of the region is now Turkish, Persian still is considered kind of a prestige dialect. One of the wildest things I've learned about another country recently is that I think the largest city in Uzbekistan, Tashkent, most of the population there does not speak Uzbek as a home language. They speak it, they know how to speak it, but as a home language, most of the city's population actually speaks Tajik, which kind of blew my mind. Yeah, before the Russians came, like if you wanted to be educated, you had to learn Persian and read Persian literature. That was sort of the language of science and education for centuries in Central Asia.
Kind of like Latin was for a while in Europe, maybe?
Yeah, yeah, very similar in that regard. Yeah, a lot of the Turkish peoples that dominated Central Asia and that went on to invade India, for example, to found empires like the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire. Those were all Turkish peoples, but they were called Persianized Turks, specifically because they had been influenced so much by Persian culture. So, for example, the leaders of all those tribes frequently spoke Persian as their court dialect in the empires that they founded.
Cool. Persian versus Farsi. What's the difference?
Persian, basically the same thing.
Okay.
When people say Persian, they're basically referring to Farsi.
Gotcha.
But there's also a language tree that is basically the Persian language tree that encompasses a whole variety of Persian languages that have a common root. So Tajik, Pashtun, Farsi, and then a whole variety of smaller languages. I think Kurdish is actually also among them. All of them are a part of the same Persian tree, but are not themselves the Persian language.
That's a language tree that I don't know a ton about, but obviously has really deep history, given the era of the Persian Empire.
Oh, yeah. They've been around a long time. Very successful, too. So successful, they've been able to survive Islamic colonization. One of the interesting things I read about Iran is that when it was first invaded by the Arabs during the initial Islamic conquests, way back in the day, the Arabs were kind of colonial in terms of how they treated different ethnic groups. They kind of wanted everybody to just become Arab. And they were pretty successful in broad swaths of the empire. Mesopotamia, Egypt, North Africa all became mostly ethnically Arab. But they did not succeed in Persia. And the reason is that Persian culture was already just so advanced and consolidated in the region that it was very difficult for them to kind of replace them. In fact, I even read an account from one Arab ruler of Persia early in I think it was the Abbasid Caliphate or something. He was kind of lamenting that, we Arabs have come here and the Persians here have done without us for 1,000 years before we came here. But we, now that we rule Persia, cannot do without them for an hour. And that's because, of course, all of the court officials, the educated elites, all of the advisors, all of them were Persian guys who spoke Persian.
Gotcha. And they would have been pretty advanced and valuable assets. It's good that they recognize them as valuable because sometimes when conquerors show up, they just kill everybody and they don't really ask questions.
Yeah. Regrettably so.
Cool. Well, I got out of my match. Turns out I was against someone leveling a new account, so they were a smurf, but we ended up bonking him anyway.
Well done.
Yeah. It's funny whenever you face an opponent and you can tell based on what they're doing that they're not at their actual MMR yet. And this Terran, they got into the late game turtle stage pretty neatly, and they got the ghost unit en masse is what you're supposed to make against Zerg anyway. And they had a whole bunch of them. So it's like, hey, you're not actually at the bracket that you're at, are you? And we checked their win rates, and they have like 92% win rate. So we were one of their first losses. And their name was Bad Guy. Appropriately named. Well, cool. Well, thanks for breaking things down for us. We can play some HOTS after our break. And thank you, chat, for weighing in. And we will see you all in the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.